Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Paul Arvison, and this is a meeting sponsored by the American Scientific Affiliation, which is an organization that's been around about 60 years, mostly consisting of scientists, theologians, philosophers, and it's interested in the integration of science and Christian faith. The other group of people here, of course, are folks from National Presbyterian Church, and we thank you all for coming. Welcome to our luncheon today, despite the snowy weather that we've suddenly been confronted with here today. So let me introduce our speaker to you briefly here. Dr. Roy Clouser is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the College of New Jersey. And he has an A.B. in philosophy from Gordon College, B.D. in theology from the Reformed Episcopal Seminary, and an M.A. and Ph.D. from the University of Pennsylvania. He has studied under people like Paul Tillich and Herman Dooyeweerd and others. So he's had an interesting background in theology and philosophy. And I think that those two kind of go together. I have a story, maybe you'll understand this, but I was thinking, there was a famous scientist, Steven Weinberg, who's an atheist, and he's down at the University of Texas, Austin, Nobel Prize winner in particle physics, and he wrote a book called Dreams of a Final Theory. And in that book, he ridiculed the philosophers. But he talked about, there was this phrase going on, Vannevar Bush coined the phrase, the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, which means, isn't it amazing that you can find major laws of physics in the universe and in mathematical form? How is it that we can come up with something as profound as something like E equals mc squared in a simple little mathematical formula, and it's correct, and it explains all kinds of things in the universe? How is that mathematics is so effective? On the other hand, and then he contrasted that with philosophy, and he said the philosophers have been wrangling with each other for centuries, never able to say what is true, never able to nail anything down, and every one of them criticizes all their predecessors. Why is that? So he calls it the unreasonable ineffectiveness of philosophy. I don't know if you heard that, but at any rate, I'm thinking Steven Weinberg is inappropriate in saying that, because, I make an analogy this way. They're different jobs. Like in a football game, you have the football players on the field, and their job is to make goals, right? It's like scientists trying to make discoveries. Well, the football players are trying to make goals, and so they will criticize the referees because the referees don't make any goals. But the referees are there to see that the football players follow the rules, right? And then the theologians are the people up in the stands asking the question, why are we playing this game? So, to kind of sort out, they're different jobs. But at any rate, Dr. Clouser has touched on all of these jobs, and he has a very wide range of background and knowledge, and so I hope that you all will pin him down with some good questions. But the topic that he's offered to talk to us about is a new critique of naturalism, and it's also based on a new book that he's working on right now, which deals with world religions from a Christian perspective, sort of, which I think is very much needed right now. He also brought along with him some of his other previous books that he's written, The Myth of Religious Neutrality, which is an interesting magnum opus, I guess, of some of his work. And then he has one more copy left of Knowing with the Heart. And so, Roy, thank you very much for coming.
Okay, so given that introduction, I've revised how I'm going to start. Except to say one thing. This is my email address. We're probably going to touch on more things than can be satisfactorily dealt with. We don't have that much time. Normally, I would be willing to hang around till 3 or 4 o'clock, but I've got to drive back to Philadelphia. And the sooner I attempt that, the sooner I will find out whether I'm stuck in a motel overnight anyway or not. So feel free to write to me with questions and other things, any objections that you may have, and it sounds just wildly wrong, whatever. And that way you don't have to throw things at me now. I wasn't going to start by explaining what philosophy is, but I think I will now. One of the best descriptions of it is by the naturalist philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, who did a lot of work in the philosophy of science. Is that a name known to any of you? He was at the University of Pittsburgh? No? See, everything I refer to is so long ago now. That's what happens when you get seriously old. Sellars said one time, philosophy is about how all things, in the widest sense of things, hang together in the widest sense of hang together. It's not bad. We have a lot of ways of studying the world from different angles. Mathematics, physics, biology, psychology, logic, sociology, economics, law, ethics. But the question is, how do they all relate? How do they hang together? And philosophy arose when people began to theorize about exactly that. And the way they approached it is very interesting. They asked, what is it that's self-existent and everything else depends on it? That's the way philosophy arose in ancient Greece. What is the self-existent reality that everything else depends on? Because if we can identify that correctly, then we'll view the dependency differently from what would happen if we identified it differently. And so from the very beginning, they had one candidate after another as to what that self-existent reality is, and that's still going on. Present-day theorists like to pretend it's not, that they've emancipated themselves from that primitive sort of history, and that's nonsense. I almost said something I shouldn't have. You can't say it's bullshit in this. So I won't. That's absolutely false. They're still revolving around what it is that's self-existent. Now, in the work that I did, both in the Myth of Religious Neutrality and the book I'm working on, I have a lot of documentation that is exactly what religion is. It identifies the self-existent reality that everything else depends on. And in fact, to shorten the summary, there's no way for anybody to prove what that is. No matter what you think that is, there's no way to demonstrate that your view is right and everybody else's is wrong. That doesn't mean that it's blind trust, however. The alternative is that people in fact take to be the self-existent reality, whatever they take to be that, because it looks self-evident to them that that's the truth. It's intuitive. It's like seeing the truth of an axiom. And people don't agree about axioms. You all know that. I don't have to explain that to you. There are different sets in mathematics. There are different views in logic. And when people disagree about what the axioms are, they just butt heads century after century after century, because there's no way for one to convince the other that the other is wrong. No way for anyone to show that it, above all the others, is right. No, I think that that is exactly the right definition. In other words, philosophy began with a religious point, and it's never graduated from that. It still revolves around what somebody takes to be self-evident. Self-evidently, the self-existent reality everything else depends on. Even as extreme a thinker as Richard Rorty, is that a name anybody knows? He was a pragmatist, and he wants to do away with all religion and trappings and get rid of it all, you know. And so all beliefs are just stories we tell ourselves. All beliefs are on an equal standing because nobody knows if anything's true. All they know is, and these are his own words, we believe it because we think it will make us happier than we'd otherwise be. But then, when you come to certain stories, he backtracks. So he says, what really matters in life is not getting things right, but that we band together, huddled against the dark. That's what's really important. So I take it that although he has said all the stories are equally fictions, the biological facts aren't fictions. We do die. We do huddle and battle what's life-threatening. So the question is, why is that right and all the others aren't? It's because he's got a kind of materialism that he's hidden, that he doesn't like to talk about. But it's there. It's the assumption behind what he makes out we ought to do. And, of course, if you say this is what we ought to do, you're saying it's true that this is what we ought to do. Not just a story we make up and tell ourselves. Besides, it's patently false that we accept what we believe because we think it would make us happier than we'd otherwise be. When my wife got a report that she had cancer, that did not make me happier than I'd otherwise be to believe it. Now, what I want to talk to you today is about the history of naturalism. Naturalism with a big capital N is the view that all there is the universe. So the universe is what's self-existent. Clear? That's divine. The divine in every religion is whatever they think is the self-existent origin of everything else. You'll find that definition in Plato, you'll find it in Aristotle, you'll find it in the medieval thinkers, you'll find it in modern thinkers, you'll find it in contemporary thinkers, and yet it's ignored in all the studies of religion and religion and science. People start mouthing off about the right relation between the two things. They have a fair grasp of what the sciences do and not a bloody idea what religion is when they talk about it. Let me review a bit of that history for you. One of the earliest theories was that it is, and I'll do it this way, the quantitative side of reality that is the divine. We notice that things in the world have a how much to them. They have a quantity. We represent quantities by symbols, numbers. We look at the relationships between numbers. We get mathematics. That's a realistic view of mathematics, right? It's not something we just invent wholesale out of our heads and then are mystified by why it applies to the world at all. No, it's because we've abstracted some characteristic of the world to begin with. That's why it applies. And the Pythagoreans did that too. And they spoke about this in terms of numbers and the ratios, that is the relations, between numbers. And they said, and this is what everything depends on. Not atoms, numbers. This is the reason that when you do a mathematical formula correctly, the world's always the way you predict it. If you want to know how far it is from here to there, and you measure the length of this shadow, and you triangulate, it always comes out right, because the world's made of these things. This is what reality really is. It's numbers and their relationships. Now, why would somebody propose a thing like that? For this reason. When you think about the universe and you ask what it is that's self-existent, it can't be the whole shooting match. It can't be that the entire universe and everything in it is self-existent, because we watch things come into being and pass away, do we not? And whatever comes into being and passes away is not self-existent. So it can't be everything in the universe. So which part of the universe is it that's self-existent that all the rest depends on? And one of the early answers was numbers. And the Pythagoreans recognized that that was not only a philosophical position and their position in mathematics that influenced their theory of mathematics, but it was also religious. They worshipped numbers. Here's part of one of their prayers. It's a prayer to the number 10. Bless us, divine number, thou that generates gods and men. For number begins with the holy pure unity. That's the number 1. And passes through, and then has other successions, until it comes to the holy tractates. That was a geometrical figure, in which you have sides of a triangle, and every side adds up to 10. And then it comes to the holy Mother 10, the never swerving, never tiring Mother of all things. That was one of their prayers. Now, you understand, what I have explained to you does not rest solely on the fact that they added worship to this. This isn't religious because they worshipped it. It's religious because they believed it was self-existent. Plenty of religions in the world have no worship. Theravada Buddhism, Brahmin Hinduism, don't worship. There's nothing to worship. Worship makes sense only if you think that the divine, whatever that is also personal, can hear you and care. Otherwise, you don't bother. I guess I don't have to explain to this group that spatial properties aren't the same as quantitative properties. In fact, the quantitative seems to be a precondition for space. There has to be a how much of space. But people have proposed that it's space that's infinite, eternal, and self-existent and generates everything else. And they're not all ancient. John Wheeler, who just died recently, held that view, and so did Fred Hoyle and others. Matter, they said, is like concentrated space. Space spontaneously generates protons, said Hoyle. Okay? This assumes that it's a spatial side of reality, the spatial properties and laws that are self-existent and generate all the others. And of course, we all know about people who say, no, no, it's the physical. These are called materialists. And again, to this group, I don't have to explain that that doesn't mean somebody that's only interested in money. It means somebody who says that objects that are purely physical, that have only physical properties, and are governed by only physical laws, generate everything else that's true of the universe. And then there are all different versions of this, depending on how much else you think there is that the physical generates. Is that clear? Got it on instant replay. That's not clear. There are all versions of materialism depending on how much else the purely physical is supposed to generate. There are materials that say there's nothing else. Everything is purely physical, has only physical properties, is governed by only physical laws. That's quite an extreme view. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about concepts, or the perception of red, or how much something costs, or whether something's just or unjust. Those are all fictions. It has only mass, weight, density, specific gravity, charge. Properties that are related to one another by physical laws. That's it. Nothing else. One of them cleverly wrote, nature has equipped us, nature assumed to be purely physical, for the 4 F's: fleeing, fighting, feeding, and reproducing. She said, and she goes on, truth, whatever that is, takes the hindmost. But if all things are purely physical and truth, we don't even care, what's that say about that theory? Isn't she proposing it is true?
Right.
Okay.
And that is purely physical.
Now, nowadays, we don't find many people who hold that it's the numerical, the quantitative, that is absolute or self-existent. There are people in recent history who have held that. Werner Heisenberg did. He held that there were eternal mathematical laws for motion, and that what we call energy is almost next to nothing. It's almost non-being, he says, but what gives everything its form are the eternal mathematical laws, and then he adds, this fits with the Pythagorean religion. He says that of his own point of view. And there aren't too many people who are still holding that it may be space, but a lot of people nowadays are saying it's purely physical. And that physicalism, that belief that it's the physical, purely physical things that give rise to everything else, that's the very basis of science. I'm going to show you before we leave today that is not only not the basis of science, it makes science impossible. In fact, I'll go further. That claim is meaningless. And I hope you'll see that for yourself before we adjourn. So there are 2 versions of this, and I call them strong and weak, for the sake of the non-scientists that might read it. Strong physicalism is the view that I just quoted. Things have only physical properties and are governed by only physical laws. Everything else is nada. Bupkis. The weaker claim is the basic reality is purely physical, but it does generate other things. So there are other properties that we can observe, and we say we don't dismiss them as unreal, but we say they're produced by the purely physical. In fact, some of those are even liberal enough to say that the purely physical reality can generate another kind of reality that's not physical at all. Some of this kind of materialists claim that we do have minds, and minds aren't purely physical. What our mental capacities have to do with can't totally be explained by neuron functioning. So they hold there are minds in addition to brains, but the mind is the product of the brain.
Is this the phrase emergences? Is that?
Yes. Yeah, sure. So on this view and the weak view, they would all hold some kind of emergent view, and the strong view denies any emergence. Now, all of that's different from someone who's a dualist. A dualist says there are physical things and there are non-physical things that are also self-existent. They've got two self-existent principles. Usually they say it's the physical, the purely physical, and the laws of rationality, the laws of mathematics and logic. And minds are those non-physical entities that operate by the laws, by the non-physical laws, and brains are those physical entities that operate by the physical laws. So they make these two independent. And all of these three views these three cover 99% of the naturalists today. Now, each criticizes the other. And I have a chapter in the new book that I'm doing in which I relate the main criticisms that each one makes of the other, and I end it by saying, and they're all correct about one another. Each one has put their finger on something direly wrong that cannot be cured, and they're all correct. Let me see if I can explain some of it. Let's take the strong materialist first. Here's the claim. Nothing has any properties or is governed by any laws that are non-physical. Okay. Now let's just consider the strong physicalist claim. That claim is expressed in 13 words on that board. But the strong physicalist says that things don't have quantitative properties. They only have physical ones. Math is something we purely invent, like a game. You just invent it, and you set down the rules, and if you don't break the rules, you get the right answer. But then that says the claim isn't 13 words long, and in English it is. Second thing is, you understand the meaning of that sentence, don't you? But meaning isn't physical. Physical things have only mass, weight, density, specific gravity, charge. Meaning isn't related by physical laws. It's related by logical laws, linguistic laws. And lastly, that claim is offered to us, I take it, as the truth. But truth isn't a physical property either. So the strong physicalist's claim is that its claim isn't 13 words long, it isn't true, and it doesn't have any meaning. And so it belongs in the waste can. It defeats itself. The weak physicalists like to point that out. If you want examples of strong physicalists, then the one that I quoted a while ago was Pat Churchland, and she and her husband Paul are both strong physicalists. There's nothing but the things with physical properties governed by physical laws. And Paul's theory is that all other talk is what he calls folk psychology talk. It's just like talk about witches and goblins and fairies, and it'll all be swept away as neuroscience progresses. We'll lose those vocabularies. Okay. The weak physicalist, as someone here astutely pointed out, believes in emergence. What's purely physical and governed by purely physical laws gives rise to things that have biotic properties or logical properties. But nobody can ever explain how that's even possible. If the original reality is purely physical and is governed by purely physical laws, how does the purely physical produce what is not physical at all? And emergence looks like a hope and a wish, not an explanation. There's no source, no third source, no other way to get a principle that will bridge the physical and the non-physical. A physical law can't bridge the physical and non-physical. If you propose such a law, it's not a physical law, right? It has a non-physical term. So you're caught. And to the dualists, well, we take the greatest example of a dualist, modern time, is Descartes. We have minds that are completely non-physical and brains that are completely physical, and they interact, you see. So if I'm stepping out into the street and I look and I see a bus coming, then the light waves bounce off the bus, they hit my eye, they register on the retina, they excite the optic nerve which goes around to the occipital lobe of my brain, and brain processes take place that wouldn't otherwise, and then somehow that message is conveyed to my non-physical mind. But see, there's the same problem again. How does the physical produce an effect that is purely not physical? Likewise, it goes in the other direction. I decide, I better not step out there, I'm going to get mashed. So I pull my foot back, but that decision that takes place in the non-physical mind somehow changes the brain physically, so that it gives the right stimulus that goes down the rubrospinal tract to my large muscles of my leg, and I pull it back. How does that work? How is the interaction possible between what is purely one thing and what is purely another? There's no third something to bridge the gap. Indeed, René Descartes, who proposed this theory, was a Christian, and he said the gap is bridged by God. Every interaction between mind and body is a miracle. Yeah. I won't go into that, what a theological disaster that is, in that it renders every perception of everybody every day a miracle. He meant he had no explanation. So, but he had a third something he could appeal to. He had more than what the naturalist dualist has. The naturalist dualist doesn't believe in God, so has no third something that could possibly bridge the gap between the two. And so they go around and round and round, century after century, the dualists saying that if it's all physical, then it isn't true or false, it's just faster or slower, more highly charged or less. It can't be true or false. And them saying to the dualist, how do you explain the relation between mind and body? And they can't do it. And that's where they leave it. I want to take us a little past that, if possible, today, and I'm going to offer to you an argument which is not going to be abstruse and arcane, no modal logic, nothing weird. It's a thought experiment, and I'm going to ask you to perform it. You only see the force of this argument if you actually try to perform the experiment. The experiment, however, requires just a little more background. What I want to point out to you is that these different kinds of properties and laws, and that's I'm saying that with hyphens, kinds of properties and laws, right? We have quantitative, spatial, physical. They're the main ones that are these days held to be self-existent. But in the past, people have held others. They have held the logical to be self-existent. There's a long tradition of that. Logical laws are self-existent. They govern even God, most of the Christian theologians said. I think that's terrible, but that's what they've said. These are self-existent. No matter what we pick, which of these kinds we pick, the first thing I want you to notice is that there are active and passive properties in each of these kinds. Let's start with the quantitative. The Earth is the third planet from the Sun. That's a quantitative fact about the Earth. That's true of the Earth whether or not anybody knows it. But the earth, that's an active property then. It's something it has whether or not anybody knows it, and irrespective of how it relates to any human being. But then there are other properties that are quantitative that are passive. They depend on us. The planet Earth is also countable. We can count to 3 and find that it's the third planet from the sun. So what I'm pointing to here is this difference. Things have passive properties as well as active ones. In space, the spatial properties of a thing. A thing has certain location, a certain size, a certain shape. It's also locatable. Right? That's passive. It's locatable with respect to us, exercise, right? Its locatableness isn't actuated until we locate it, or somebody tries to. Is that clear? Try some more? Okay, let's try the one that I didn't even put here. Let's talk about sensory properties that things have that we perceive. I was taught this in junior high, and I'll bet you were too. This is not really brown, I was taught. It has no color at all. It's just a physical surface of a certain construction, and it reflects light. It absorbs some light and reflects other. It looks brown to you because it absorbs all the light waves that don't look brown to us. The ones that do bounce back and they hit you in your eye, and brown occurs somewhere in here. It's not out there. All right? No, that's confusing these two things. Because even if it isn't actively brown, it's passively brown. That is, this has the property of appearing brown to normal vision and normal light. But that's passive. Somebody has to see it for that to be activated, for it to become actual in the world, yeah? It applies to that old question, if a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? It depends whether you're talking about in the active sense or the passive. Passively, it does just those things which would be heard as a sound were anybody there to hear it. But if nobody is, then actively, no, it didn't make a sound. You understand? We're equivocating two different senses. And the active-passive is important. Now, here's another reason why it's important. It's virtually impossible for anybody to deny this. See, what they'd have to say is, no, the Earth doesn't really have the property of being countable, but they just counted it. They know it's the third property from the sun. They know that's not true, right? They can't say this doesn't really have the property of appearing brown to normal vision and normal light. Sure it does. It's appearing that way to you right now. Am I making it? Is this not clear to anybody? I'll stop right here if it's not. It's impossible to deny that there are passive properties of every kind that we experience. We experience many more kinds: biotic, social, ethical, economic, yeah, all kinds of stuff. But there are passive properties as well as active ones. Think about biology. Something carrying on photosynthesis or metabolism is an active property. But being edible is a passive property. Okay? Water isn't alive, but nothing can live without it, at least the life forms we have on Earth. So the life forms appropriate that water. It becomes part of the life cycle without itself being alive. It's passively acted upon in a living thing. Tell me if it's not clear. Okay. Because this has a lot to do with whether any of these are serious candidates for divinity. Can any of these be said to be self-existent? And that's what the thought experiment we're going to do is going to show you, that the answer is no.
Is the word or concept self-existent specifically related to the active only? Or are those two very different concepts?
Right. Something would have to be actively self-existent. That's right.
Self-existent must be in this.
It is so whether anybody knows it or not.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Self-existent mean or imply also eternal, that is, having always been there and always continuing?
Yes, they're not the same thing, but, and here I will quote John Calvin, who ought to be welcome here. That which is the origin of everything else is necessarily self-existent and eternal. I think it's extremely difficult to argue with that. If it's the origin of everything else, it's self-existent and it didn't have a beginning. And if it's self-existent, it'll never have an end. So it's at least everlasting. Of course, we think that, as we know, because the New Testament teaches us that God is outside time altogether, so he's eternal in that transcendent sense as well, because he created time also. All right. Now, if this much is clear, then with that as background, we're going to try out some of these as candidates for divinity. Now remember that while the ancient philosophers and scientists all came clean as to what they thought it was, which thing or things are the self-existent ones everything else depends on, their modern day counterparts will not do that. Nobody wants to say which things everything depends on. Is it atoms? Is it protons? Is it quarks? No, nobody will come clean on that. They're sure whatever it is, it's physical. So they're not committed to which thing, they're committed to what kind of things it is everything depends on. Is that clear? And that's what we're going to attack. Now I have one more piece of background. I want you to see why it is that they have to say that something or other is purely this. It's purely spatial, purely physical, purely logical, or so on. Right? Remember we said that philosophy had to do with how all these hang together. If you think about all these areas and the other ones that I mentioned as beads on a necklace, philosophy wanted to know what's the string. And these answers, the naturalist answers, are all to pick some bead and say, this isn't really a bead, this is the string. If you don't pick something that's purely this, if it's a mixture, then what everything really depends on is how they could possibly mix. And you haven't gotten to the ultimate self-existent reality. That's why the materialist has to speak of the purely physical, or the purely spatial, or the Pythagorean, the purely numerical or quantitative, and so forth. The rationalist, what's purely logical. And this purely stuff has plagued philosophy from the very beginning, and it has not gone away, and it plagues philosophy of science to this day. It's not the case that the scientists all agree and the philosophers don't. It's that the philosophers are they come clean about their differences and dwell on them. And scientists like to overlook the differences and say, look, whether you think that equation or this theorem represents a self-existent reality or not, we all know it works here. So let's just use it and we won't argue about which it is. That's fine. That's great. They didn't do that, science couldn't go ahead. But the differences are still there. That's what I argued in the Myth of Religious Neutrality. It means that there's no theory you can make that's religiously neutral. There are umpteen versions of almost any theory depending on what the thinker thinks is divine. What does it all depend on? And when they think different things for that slot, they get very different interpretations of math, logic, physics, biology, sociology, ethics, law, whatever it is. Okay, let's try this with the physical. I love to pick on the materialists because they're so arrogant. They just beg for it. So let's see if we can, what happens if we try to think of a thing as being exactly what they claim it is. Let's take this beat up old briefcase. None of us will deny that it is, at least in part, physical. It has mass. It has weight. It's somewhat solid. Let's see if we can conceive of it, however, apart from all the other kinds of properties it appears to have. Materialists admit that things don't look exclusively physical. They look to have multiple kinds of properties. But in reality, they have only the physical. So let's start with this. Take this and subtract from it all quantity. It has no how much. And now take away its spatiality. It has no size and no shape and no location. Now take away from it its logical property of being able to be distinguished. That's a passive property in the logical, of the logical kind. Able to be distinguished from other things. And the linguistic property of being able to be referred to in language. And tell me what's left of your idea of that. Somebody got the same thing I get. What is a briefcase that has no quantity, is nowhere, can't be distinguished from anything else, it can't be spoken of? Of course, it also can't be perceived. That's a passive sensory property. Are we not now talking about exactly nothing? When you take away all the non-physical properties, the physical goes with them. Now maybe you think that was a cheap shot. Look, let's not take a concrete object. Let's take an abstract, say the property of weight. Surely that's a physical property. Now let's try the same thing with the abstract property of weight. What is weight that has no quantity, no location, isn't logically distinguishable from anything else and can't be referred to in language? So when you do all that, was haben wir? What have you got?
Van argument. Carries no weight.
The physical disappears with everything else. And the amazing thing is that this same thing happens no matter which one you try to make the self-existent divine one that generates all the rest. We can repeat this with the logical. What is a logical relation that has no quantity? I'm assuming people know some modern logic. We have quantifiers. And you have to have quantifiers. You have to know whether you're talking about all or some. There are spatial domains for quantifiers. There has to be meaning to the terms. It has to be able to be expressed in language. Logic presumes sets, and there's a quantity to the number of members of a set. If you abstract all the others away, the logical disappears too. You no longer know what you're even talking about. Same thing is true if you try it with number or sensory perception. That's interesting, isn't it? They want us to believe that this is the way reality is, and if you try to think of it that way, you end up with zip. You're not thinking of anything. In other words, behind the verbal expression, purely physical, there is no concept whatsoever.
It's $10.
We know what it means for something to be physical, and we understand what purely means, but when you put them together, you get nothing. Not the ultimate reality. You get Zippo. If I already illustrated it for logic, so it attacks the dualist as well. The dualist not only can't say how the purely logical interacts with the purely physical, he has no idea of anything purely logical or purely physical to begin with. The claims are literally meaningless. And they are certainly not the basis of doing science. What scientist in any one of the sciences and in any capacity views something as purely physical, purely logical, purely numerical, purely any? No. They view all the things they work with as having all those kinds of properties at once. And as to the question, what is it that hangs them all together? The Christian knows the answer already. It's from Colossians. Christ created all things, and in him all things hang together. It isn't any part of the universe that hangs it all together, it's God. And that's just what's wrong with all the searches for all the centuries to find what it is in the universe that is what everything else depends on, because it ain't there. And that, in part, is why they all argue with each other century after century and never convince one another and never come to any final conclusion. But then neither do the scientists who presuppose the same things. It's because all those answers that try to take some aspect of the universe and make that what everything else in the universe depends on are false. And in fact, you literally can't conceive of any one of them. Well, that's the argument. Well, yeah.
You're still making, I still see your briefcase.
Yes.
You made it disappear, but it's still there.
I think the materialists made it disappear.
In terms of thinking about the quote purely physical, if I think about the purely physical in Newtonian type terms of dimensions and properties, it doesn't make it non-physical that the physical has properties, dimensions, etc. I don't see why purely physical, and then you take away weight and dimension and all the rest. I think that you made it disappear. You're a magician. You made it disappear too quickly.
No, you're including some non-physical properties in your example. Dimension would be a spatial property. Spatial properties are related by geometric laws and mathematical laws, not by physical laws. Shapes themselves, abstract shapes, don't fall to the ground if unsupported. They don't violate the second law of thermodynamics, nor do they conform to it. It just doesn't apply to them. See? So, in fact, what we experience when we experience the objects that we work with in the world, in everyday experience and in the science lab, are things that have multiple kinds of properties all at once, and we treat them as though they really do. So, somebody who works in a lab couldn't possibly believe that there are no, in practice, that there are no sensory properties. They have to perceive what they're doing. You see this streak in a Wilson cloud chamber, or you have to read this gauge, or you weigh this, or you even just look at the meniscus in a graduate cylinder. It's the simplest stuff, but it has to be sensorily perceivable. And then it's logically distinguishable from other things. If things don't have logical properties of being distinguishable, that's a passive property, then you can't tell one thing from another. I hate to mention it, this is an old saying about knowing your ass from your elbow. You can't do that if nothing's logically distinguishable.
I'm not a materialist, but I used to be. And I'm not sure the materialist argument is exactly as you phrase it. I think a materialist would say that all the other properties come from the material physical.
Okay, that was the second one, right? That's well, I don't have it here. That's the weak materialist.
The weak materialist.
Yeah.
So
I've attacked the strong.
okay.
But what you have to notice is that strong materialism is basic to weak materialism. Weak materialist wants to say there are other kinds of properties, but they are generated by the purely physical.
Exactly.
And I'm saying he doesn't even have an idea of the purely physical. So he can't get that one off the ground. See how the one assumes the other. And I tried to explain a few minutes ago, and if it's not clear, come back at me, why they need to say this is purely physical or purely logical or spatial or numerical or whatever. Because if it itself isn't pure, then it's two beads that are connected and we still don't know the connection. So I think that the proper stance for Christians is that we say that setting this problem up as though the different kinds of properties and laws we find true of things are beads on a necklace and we want to know the string. If that's the wrong way to set it up. That they're not like beads on a necklace, they're like interwoven strands, and there is no string. And the one who interwove all the strands and sustains them transcends them all. Yeah. Yes?
So when you watch Stephen Hawking's on PBS and he's explaining how the universe works,
Right.
and he says, there's no need for God in all of this.
Right.
Because we understand how the universe works.
But with him, it all comes down to gravity.
That's right. He says the law of gravitation
not
created
further
everything. Yeah. The law of gravitation created
So God
everything.
is gravity.
Yeah, which doesn't make any sense, as though there could be the law of gravitation all by itself and there's nothing that it applies to. I mean, being subject to the law of gravity has to be a property of something for the law of gravity to be active. Laws, let me put it more gently, since it was a real gaffe on his part. I'm sure he wishes he never said it. Laws don't do anything. We formulate a law, it tells us how things relate to one another. But a law by itself doesn't do anything. It's not an agent.
It's
But
explanatory.
that's ridiculous. Yeah. Yes, Paul?
Right, it seems to me that what you're really critiquing here is not so much naturalism, but reductionism,
Same thing.
right?
Yeah. Naturalism is always involved in some vicious sort of reductionism. I mean, there's reductionism, you know, there's some senses of the term that are quite harmless, and real advances have been made in science as when you get rid of the caloric theory of heat and you go to the molecular theory. That they call that reduction. But I'm talking about ontological reduction of the kinds. And you reduce in one of two sentences. You say there are no others, there's only this one. Or you say all the rest depend on this one. Both those should be objectionable to a Christian. And unfortunately, most Christian thinkers in theology and in science and in philosophy have not held to that. When the pagan philosophers asked, what is it that is self-existent and everything else depends on it? What is it in the universe that's like that? The early Christian thinkers did not say with one voice as they should have, nothing! It's God. They didn't. They said, this is perfectly okay as long as we say, as we add, and that in turn depends on God, and that has baptized it. So now we can entertain any candidate for semi-divinity within the universe. Anything within the universe might be what everything else in the universe depends on, so long as that in turn depends on God. And I find that it's the Eastern Orthodox theologians that resist that best. St. Gregory Palamas, for example, says the Christian can tolerate no mediating substance between God and creatures. It's not that everything else depends on X and X depends on God. Everything directly depends on God. And he says that because Paul tells us that there's only one mediator between God and humans, and that was the God incarnate.
Right.
And Christian thinkers for centuries have worked with that. Plato says it's form and matter that all the world's made of. So we'll go ahead with that, and we'll be Platonists, but we'll add, and God created form and matter. Or Aristotle says it's substances, so we'll say, that could be right, but God created the substances. Or Descartes says it's minds and bodies, but God created them. Or we have materialists today, and say they're materialists and Christians. Why can't it all be physical, as long as God created it? Yeah. Bad stuff. Now, that's why I wrote this first book about a Christian philosopher who saw that point and asked, what should philosophy look like? What should a theory of reality look like that can be useful to all the sciences, that doesn't do this? What would a theory of reality look like that presupposes only God is self-existent and nothing in the universe is what everything else in the universe depends on? And he spelled out one of the most original, brilliant theories of reality I've ever seen. And nobody's heard of it. That's why I wrote the book. And I've had any number of my colleagues in philosophy who are not Christian read that and go, whoa, I had no idea anybody did anything like this. I mean, this is really impressive. That's their reaction. Qua philosophy as a theory of reality. And that fellow's name is a Dutch name, Dooyeweerd. And he wrote this stuff roughly between 1935 and 1955, and then published it in a big 4-volume work that's so daunting nobody wants to read it, you see. And so I did my PhD dissertation on him. And so here's a simplified introduction. That's the last 3 or 4 chapters of that book. But these guys were working from the idea that there ought to be a uniquely Christian point of view. It doesn't mean you have to reinvent the whole of science. It doesn't mean, for example, that you can't accept atomic theory. But you will accept it. But you and I don't believe that atoms are purely physical. They're not purely expressions of eternal self-existent laws for motion either. There are laws for motion. There is mathematics involved. They are physical among other things, that they have many sides to them. They are not to be reduced to just one kind of thing. So it's a, what Dooyeweerd wrote is a completely, systematically non-reductionist theory of reality. And then he called for people in all the special sciences to apply it and show how he needs to be corrected or supplemented or whatever. It's not at all imperialistic. Okay, we won't get off on that. But do you understand the experiment, the thought experiment? Somebody who talks about the purely physical, the purely spatial, the purely quantitative, the purely logical, can't tell you what they mean. And as soon as they do, they start to mix in other kinds of things. See, I made this point to a group of graduate students one time at Penn, and I was talking about Plato. Plato talks about justice in itself, right? Pure justice. Not which things have the property, but the perfect form of justice itself. I said, so tell me, when you try this, tell me what you get. What is justice apart from human social interactions? Biotic conditions for life, economic conditions for life. And I went on and on and on. What is it that's apart from all of them? Because he wants to know not about how it relates to the other things, but what is justice in itself? I said, when I try that, I get nothing. So somebody from the back of the room said, well, I'm not sure, we don't get much, but I'm not sure it's nothing. He said, why couldn't we say justice bids us do what is just? So I said, I'm sorry, that won't work. You just smuggled in the back door everything we kicked out the front door, because you said to me, justice bids us do. Now, an action requires space to occur in. It requires physical energy. It has to have a numerical unity. It's logically distinguishable. It's linguistically referable. All the rest of them, they all come back. You smuggled them in. So then there was quite a silence. And so another voice from the back of the group said, so you're pointing a flamethrower at the history of philosophy? Well, I think that's what belief in God should have done. I wish that the early Christian thinkers, instead of trying to adopt Plato and Aristotle, and I'm not saying there are no insights that are worthwhile in Plato and Aristotle, but instead of trying to adopt their whole approach and their theory of reality, would have corrected it in this way and gone on from there. Yes, sir?
When you say early Christian thinkers, and you wish that they, who are you thinking of?
Well,
and is there anything that is philosophical that, or anyone that you would point to that was not asking those sort of basic philosophical presuppositional questions?
Okay. Throughout the history of Christian thought, there's been an occasional thinker who's seen something very like this. Almost all of them, or close to it. Pascal comes to mind. You know, what we should not be caught up with is the God of the philosophers. That's a philosophical construct. But the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that's who I came to know. But when you ask whom am I thinking of, well, obviously the name Origin has to come to mind. And Augustine. Unfortunately, Augustine, who made wonderful contributions all over the place, was also a Platonist. And he tells us in his autobiography that he became a Platonist first and then a Christian. And so he quotes Plato talking about this realm of perfections, and the chief perfection Plato called the God and Father of all things, and he says, God, now meaning with a capital G, is that perfection. So he identifies the God of the Bible with a perfection hypothesized by Plato. And that becomes hugely influential for all the rest of thought, because Augustine became such an authority that by the time you get to the Middle Ages, people just quote him and that ends the discussion. He's got to be right. And I think, unfortunately, where he was wrong, it really caused a lot of mischief. I talked about that this morning in the wrestlers class. He makes very fateful assumptions sometimes, and they're motivated by a Platonistic outlook. Now again, the Eastern Church always resisted that. This is the irony. The people in the Eastern Church were native Greek speaking. They were raised on Plato and Aristotle, and they recognized that's not Christian. They rejected it. The people in the Latin-speaking West found Plato and Aristotle and said, this is wonderful, let's combine the gospel with it, and we'll get the whole truth. So Plato and Aristotle will tell us about nature, and the Bible will tell us about supernature, and together we'll have the whole story. For example, in the Western Church, it has long been held that the laws of logic are not created. Logic and mathematics, they're not created. They're part of God. So they can't be other than they are. In the Eastern Church, they said the division in reality is not between the rational truths and the material. It's between the creator and the creature. Everything that's not God is created by God. And they quoted that God has created all things visible or invisible. If you reflect on that, it's a tautology that everything's either visible or innate. Yeah. Yeah. So they held that God created the laws of logic and mathematics. Whereas the Western Church exempted the rational truths from having been created. So there are things over which God has no control. He has to obey them too. Yes?
Hope you will accept a naive question.
Absolutely.
About people who are not into this topical area you're addressing. How big an issue is this question of materialism or naturalism as it manifests itself in seminaries, in scientific leadership, and also for the future of the church regarding evangelism, staying loyal to the church, keeping our faith?
It does.
It's probably a big issue, but some of us don't realize it.
Well,
So what question?
there's nothing naive about that. It's a very good question. Our children, or our grandchildren, depending on how old we are.
Yeah.
I'm very old, but I tell my students I'm really 300. But I look young because I suck the blood of undergraduates. Our children and grandchildren are going to be taught that science is based on materialism. There was an article in Scientific American just a couple of years ago which talked about the number of people who, distressingly to those editors, are Christian, like Francis Collins and others, and are doing good scientific work. And the editor concluded the editorial this way: but theism and materialism are not on the same basis. Science depends on materialism. That's why this argument needs to be rubbed in their noses. It's false. You don't need to be a materialist to be a scientist. And in fact, they can't name one founder of any modern science who was a materialist or who didn't believe in God. Even Darwin, when he wrote his theory, believed in God. And he never saw any conflict between the theory of evolution and his belief in God. He said, my conclusion is, this is a paraphrase, it's not word for word, my conclusion is that the Creator has brought about species by natural means, just as he brings about each individual by natural means. He later became an agnostic, not because of the theory of evolution, but because his daughter died. And he couldn't see how a good God could let that happen. That's a different problem, a problem of evil. But it has nothing to do with the conflict with science. But nobody, Galileo, Copernicus, Newton, Kepler, Brahe, No, well, I'm talking about the founders of modern science. Yeah. No, Einstein was not a believer. Yeah. I mean, when you come into the 20th century, you can find distinguished thinkers who are not. You find a lot that are. Edward Teller, Kurt Gödel. Gödel was a Jew, but he had a proof of God's existence, mathematical logic. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm wondering, what do you think are the implications of this too, just for the scientific method in general, in terms of its limitations or?
Yeah, I think it frees. You're free to work with any kinds of properties that things appear to have. It doesn't mean you can never be deceived. It doesn't guarantee that everything is seen exactly as it is. That's not true. But we all know that from the time we're little. You know, we're very small when we figure out that things don't really get smaller the further away they are. But it means that unabashedly we can deal with things actually having these sensory properties, these logical properties, these physical properties, spatial, mathematical, and all the rest. And that they're all true at once. Take a case of a microbiologist observing organisms under a microscope. And suppose her interest there is how they reproduce and how fast it happens and so on. So she makes use of counting. They have quantity. That matters. To somebody else with a different perspective, that might mean a lot of money. You know, can we get them to multiply faster, we can make more money. But you're looking at the same phenomena, but they have economic passive properties, as well as active physical ones or whatever, biotic ones. Yeah, it makes it all many-sided rather than the narrow, it's got to just be this.
Well, I guess I'm also wondering, is there a sense in which the scientific method limits itself? I mean, just in the sense that, well, for example, I'm a psychologist, so I do kind of soft science, I guess you could say, or I apply soft science rather. But one of the big tensions in psychology is between the scientists who produce knowledge and between the practitioners who apply knowledge. One of those big difficulties being that the scientists measure pure concepts, or what they think are pure concepts, which in reality you never see.
Well, in the view that I've sketched, it's reality that's in control. We can have any kind of theory we want. We try it out, doesn't work, it's wrong. So we're not pushing reality into the mold, whatever preconceived theory we have. It's got to be the other way around. The feedback has to show us whether the theory is any good. So it's clearly on that side of things. It's good. In that sense, it's empirical.
But it seems like, it seems like looking at a more full sense of what is would also put a lot of pressure on the scientific community, if that were widely accepted, to kind of widen their concept, I guess.
It would.
Of, what they're measuring.
I think that's right. I have a chapter on psychology in this book, and it shows how a number of different theories are controlled by different divinity beliefs. And then it suggests that a Christian view would start with different assumptions. A genuine free will, for example, is one. But I have a wonderful quote there, and one of the guys that saw the same thing. It shouldn't be reductionist. There have been people. Piaget rejected reduction. But he says it's only aspects of people that are like rats in a maze, or like bees in a hive, or there are all these different sides. And from our point of view, our meaning people that adopt this kind of broad ontology, the trouble with the other reductionist views is they all grabbed a hold of some insights and some real truths, and then try to make everything explainable in terms of that. So that there's some truth in almost any view you find, and we can look for that and accept it, but then it's not the whole story.
Right.
So just as you don't have to be a materialist to have atomic theory, you don't have to be a reductionist to believe evolutionary theory. There could be evolutionary theory, that evolution took place, fine, but it doesn't explain everything about human beings. It explains biological characteristics and how they developed, and so, okay, fine. And those have influences on other things.
You have to limit its generalizability, I think is kind of what you're saying.
I didn't hear you.
You have to limit the
Yes, yeah,
generalization.
it explains so far. They try to
Right.
make each thing the whole story.
Right.
So, survival of the fittest is not going to explain why we can appreciate and write music. It has no survival value. Or do calculus. If you're out in the wild running around, you don't need calculus. You just need to know how many tigers are chasing you. Probably don't need to count past 10. But, you know what I mean? It doesn't explain everything. So the point is to appropriate the insights, but see where they apply and where they stop, what their limits are. And it does make everything more complicated. Yeah, it's much more simple if you say, no, it's all this, and you just go with that and you close your eyes to everything else, but then it doesn't comport with reality. Yeah.
What do you think of the concept of methodological naturalism?
Yeah, see, that's to me, that's very ironic. If all that means is that in scientific work, Christians don't postulate miracles to cover up gaps, I'd agree with it. But the fact is, naturalism is based on a religious belief. Some part of the universe is the self-existent origin of the rest. And the irony of that is that the naturalists who claim to believe that actually operate as though they're Christians. They actually operate, when they go into the lab or when they actually do their work, they look at everything as having many sides to it, not as being the one and only they claim it is true of it, or the one that generates all the rest. They don't view it that way. They can't. They are forced to act as though theism is true.
So pure materialists have to act.
Yeah.
So theism is true, is their
Yes.
interruption.
Yeah. They have to act as though at least one consequence of theism is true, namely that all these different kinds of properties and laws are equally real. And they can't do without them. They can't do their work without them. Nobody who goes into a lab just sees the physical properties of everything around him. If he did, he couldn't perceive them. He couldn't logically distinguish them. He couldn't count them. They wouldn't be locatable anywhere, and so on. So he can't work like that. So instead of saying Christians operate with methodological naturalism as though God doesn't exist, no, the existence of God makes a big difference. Exactly the difference that you don't reduce everything to any one thing in the universe. And that's really important.
So as hard as you try to perform methodological naturalism, you can't.
Yeah, you can't do that.
Because of all the other properties that are involved that are not.
That's right. They actually work as methodological theists. It's not that we work as methodological naturalists. And they can't help them. They can't do otherwise. And some of the materialists these days are even saying that to the others. Galen Strawson is one.
Well,
The effort to try to do it is working against them, because
Yes.
there's nothing in materialism that
Right,
would
they
force
say
them
this
to
is
do
what
that.
we believe, and then they go ahead and do science, so it's not what they believe.
well, there's some great examples in physics if you look at the observer effect of quantum mechanics. I mean, what is that? That's not, that doesn't fit into materialism at all.
No,
Yeah.
that sure doesn't.
But they're forced to admit that it's true because it fits the pattern.
And by the way, if I can piggyback on that, this business about the passive properties as well as the active, what do you think is the probability, from a naturalist point of view, that we have evolved so that we have passive capabilities in all those areas? What would account for that? Why is it that the vast majority of all the properties we ever know about in the world are passive to our active engagement?
Say that again.
Genesis teaches, I think, that the universe was created in order to create humans, which were created for fellowship with God. Now, having passive, the capacity to actualize the passive properties of things in all these kinds is a harder thing to explain by random evolutionary causes, even than the fluctuation in the expansion rate of the universe. You know, if the universe had been point and then 29 zeros, 1 faster, we wouldn't have gotten carbon-based life. If it had been that point 1 slower, we wouldn't have got carbon-based life. That's really minuscule. But there's even less of a chance that by random causes, we end up being able to actualize the passive properties of things in all these vast array. It looks as though it was created for us, and we were created for it. That's not a proof of God's existence. It's an argument that points to something that we would expect if we were created for fellowship with God, and it's right what's there. Yes, go ahead.
Now, what is the incentive for philosophers to reduce everything to some one self-existent thing and exclude the others? It seems, from what we heard from you this morning, that and in my mind, rather obvious that these things are related and not independent. But there must be some strong driver
Yes.
to drive them to
That's right.
believe. What's the incentive?
That strong driver, that is what Paul in Romans 1 calls sin. He says that God made himself known to people and they rejected him, and they turned the truth about God into a falsehood and worship and serve something God had created instead of the Creator. They're unwilling to even entertain that God is the Creator. It's got to be something in the universe because it can't be God. And they'll say this: we can't allow a divine foot in the door, says Lewinton. It's because they're afraid it might be right.
Okay, Roy, I think we're going to stop here.
I think our time's...
Thank you so much again.
Sure.
Thank you.